My name is Dennis McGee, and I'm here with you on Prophecy for the Last Hour. And this is a program that connects to end-time prophecy. And tonight we're looking at the Shemitah, the law of the Shemitah and the year of the Shemitah. I brought with me a Jewish calendar, which shows, which begins in September of 2014 and ends in September of 2015. And it shows that we are in a year of Shemitah. If you were living in Israel right now, you would be prohibited from agriculture, from growing crops in the ground, and because that was part of the Mosaic law for the year of Shemitah. It's a sabbatical year. Every seventh year was a year of Shemitah, and then after 7 years of Shemitah, which comes out to 49 years, you have a year of Jubilee, which is an additional sabbatical year. It's the 50th year. It's also the first year, the next pattern of Shemitahs. And in the year of Jubilee, all land would be returned to the original owner. In the law of Shemitah, and in the year of Shemitah, all debts were to be canceled and all slaves were to be set free. So there was a great social justice element to Shemitahs and Jubilees in the nation of Israel. And when they practiced them, they had a strong middle class, and they were blessed of the Lord. But if you read in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, you found that after Israel instituted their kings, the kings did away with the Shemitahs and the Jubilees, and wealth began to become coalesced in the hands of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. So the poor became enslaved to the rich and became consistently or generationally indebted to them, and they fell into generational poverty. And this led to Jeremiah the prophet coming forward to the king of Judah and announcing that a warning from God that if they didn't let the slaves go free, that God would bring judgment. So the king announced to the nation of Judea that the slaves, that debts would be canceled and the slaves would be set free. Well, this didn't sit well with the noble class, and they forced the king to rescind the order. And so Jeremiah came forward and said, you have disobeyed the Lord, and therefore, and I'm reading in Jeremiah 25, therefore the Lord Almighty says this, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. And he goes on to say, this whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Well, it's interesting because there were actually 70 Shemitahs that the king of Judea and the nation of Judea ignored the law of Shemitah. They didn't give the land rest. In other words, they tried to overproduce the land, and they wouldn't cancel debt, which was a requirement under the Mosaic law. So they were to serve Babylon for 70 years. And this, most people think this has been completely fulfilled, but in my book, Imminent Abomination, which I wrote 8 years ago, which deals with the nation of Iraq and prophecy, I have a chapter written almost 70 years in almost 70 years in captivity. See, what occurred was Nebuchadnezzar came down from Babylon, which was in the land of what we now call Iraq, and he defeated the Egyptians, and then he forced the nations and the surrounding nations, including Israel, to pay homage to him. So they began to serve the king of Babylon, who is Nebuchadnezzar, in the year 605 BC. And it happened in the summer of 605 BC. Well, exactly 66 and a half years later, in the winter of 538 BC, the Babylonians fell to the Persians. So that ended the judgment, at least to that point, of Israel paying homage to Babylon. It was the Persians who let Israel go back to their land. And I think it's interesting because it says after the 70 years, but when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and will make it desolate forever. So what was supposed to happen after the end of the 70 years was Babylon would be destroyed forever and become forever desolate. Well, you can read about this in two other places. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 13, verse 20, it talks about Babylon in the time of the end, in the end times, being destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah and will never be inhabited again after that point. And you can read in the book of Revelation, again it says the great city Babylon will be thrown down and destroyed, never to be inhabited again. So the fact is we do have Babylon back in play. It's never been totally desolated. It was never destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. So how does this work out? Well, my theory is that the final 3.5 years of this 70-year prophecy has been held for the end times. There's quite a number of prophecies that refer to 3.5 years or 42 months or a time, times and a half a time in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation. And we'll kind of cover some of those verses. But it also says in Jeremiah 25 that in verse 30, it says here, the Lord will roar from on high. He will thunder from his holy dwelling, the roar mightily from his land. He will shout like those who tread the grapes, shout against all those who live on the earth. The tumult will result to the ends of the earth, for the Lord will bring charge against the nations, and he will bring judgment on all mankind and put the wicked to the sword. There's going to be a worldwide judgment that was supposed to happen at the end of the 70 years. It also goes on in Jeremiah 29. It tells us, 29, verse 10 and 11, this is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to your place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So it goes on to say that God will bring all 12 tribes back to Israel and give them back their land at the end of the 70 years. And finally, it goes on to say in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah 31, that Jerusalem will never be uprooted or demolished. That's Jeremiah 31, verse 40. Jerusalem at the end of the 70 years will never be uprooted or demolished. So if that 70 years was fulfilled in ancient times by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, then that would not explain why Babylon still exists, why there's still wickedness among all the nations, and why Jerusalem has been decimated. We know that in 70 AD, the Romans uprooted Jerusalem and decimated that city, and it created the diaspora, where the Jews were scattered to all the different nations. So again, I would suggest that the final 3.5 years of that 70-year prophecy will be fulfilled in the time of Revelation, in which case God has to once again rise up the Babylonians. So we look at what's going on in Iraq these days. We look at what happened in Iraq under Saddam Hussein when he rebuilt the throne room of Babylon and rededicated the city. And he used the language that's in Isaiah and in Revelation in regards to the boasting of Babylon. We can see how that country has been a real thorny predicament for all the nations, including the United States. So we got this thing, the 42 months, which I believe it refers to the time of the end. And in Matthew 24, Jesus refers to the time of the end, and he said there would be many signs. There would be famines and pestilences. There would be earthquakes in diverse places. There would be wars and rumors of war. It would be a time of sorrows or a time of birth pangs. He says, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of many would grow cold. And we see that today. I mentioned in the last time I was on this show that Pope Francis had come out and said that we're living in a time of sorrows. And he talked about how we have global conflicts going on. Nation rising against nation is what Jesus said. There would be wars and rumors of war. All these things going on. The gospel of the kingdom would be preached in the whole world, Jesus said. And with the advent of the internet, we know that that's available today for the gospel to be preached. And through satellite television, the amazing technology advances, helping advance the gospel of the kingdom, that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Savior, that he came in a year of Jubilee. His ministry started in a year of Jubilee. It was called an acceptable year of the Lord. You can read about that in chapter Luke. But he said, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to his cloak. He says those days would be very dreadful, for then there would be great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened. This is called the time of great tribulation. It's supposed to be unparalleled from any other time in history. That means it would have to be worse than the time of World War I or the time of World War II. It would be a very treacherous time for Judea and for those in Judea. And so I would suggest that it begins with the abomination as written in the book of Daniel, beginning with the king of Babylon, once again forcing Judea into servitude for that final 42 months of the 70 years that Israel ignored the Shemitahs. So again, we see how important the rule of Shemitah is to Bible prophecy. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 12, we have a prophecy about a woman who gives birth to the man-child who is destined to rule over the kings of the earth. And the vision of the woman is given in a sign in the heavens. And I was talking a little bit about that on the last broadcast. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Well, 1,260 days equals 42 months. And that is the remaining time of that 70-year prophecy in which Judea still can be uprooted or demolished, according to Jeremiah 31, and would result in the second coming of the Messiah, the second coming of Christ, in a year of Jubilee, to rescue Israel, to rescue her from, and to defeat the Babylonians. I believe that the whole stage for that is being set up right now in the Middle East. And, you know, we just have to watch and wait and watch these prophecies as they develop. But it goes on in Revelation 12 to say, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the man-child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken for a time, times, and a half a time out of the serpent's reach. A time, times, and a half a time is another way of saying 3.5 years. A time is a year, times is 2 years, and a half a time would be 1 plus 2 is 3.5. 3.5 years, or 42 months, that the woman is taken out of the reach of the dragon's kingdom. And we talked a little bit about what the dragon's kingdom was in my last time on the show. We can cover that again. But she's taken on the 2 wings of a great eagle to a place that is out of the reach of the dragon's kingdom for 42 months. I believe the 2 wings of a great eagle refer to the United States, and I believe that our country is the place set aside that is out of the reach of the dragon for that period of time. I think that is our destiny. I'm not the only one who believes that, but I've stated that on the show, and I believe that when our founders came to this country many years ago on the Mayflower, and they had a vision for seeing America as this kind of second Israel type of a thing, a place, a city on a hill, a place where Israel might be safe. And it's interesting because there's a prophecy when King David was old and he was desiring to build a temple, that Nathan the prophet, see, the prophets speak, sometimes it's not quite in line with what everybody else is thinking, but you got to make room for the prophets. And Nathan came forward and told him that there was a place prepared for his offspring where his offspring would not be persecuted and would not be forced to continually move. And that's not been the case in Jerusalem. I mean, the Jews were forced to leave Jerusalem when the Romans came in. They were forced to leave England and Spain and France. They've been strangers in a strange land many places until they came to America. There's now more Jews in America than there are in Israel, and they have found a place of religious safety in where there is no persecution going on here because of our Constitution. We have religious freedom. And I believe in our strong national defense. We're the best friend Israel has in the world, And it seems to me that in the time of Jacob's trouble, it's called, the 42 months are also called the time of Jacob's trouble, that there will be a place prepared for the offspring of the woman. The woman in Revelation is often described as Israel. It's also described as Mary, the mother of Jesus. I mentioned that there was a great sign in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and the crown of 12 stars on her head. There is a sign in the constellation of Virgo, where Virgo is seen as the woman who's giving birth to a child, and I believe there is and actually I found it on Stellarium, which is a software program, a great wonder in the sky, in the year 24 AD, which I believe is really the year 3 BC, because I believe our calendar is off by 27 years. I kind of went into that in an earlier broadcast, why I believe we're off by 27 years. If you correct our calendar by 27 years, and suddenly the year following this Shemitah year that we're in right now becomes a Jubilee year, and not just any Jubilee, but a great Jubilee, a 10th Jubilee, 40th Jubilee from the time of Christ's ministry, 70 Jubilees from when the children of Israel went into the Promised Land, 80 Jubilees from the time of Abraham's call, and 120 Jubilees from the time of Adam and Eve. I have what I call a Jubilee scroll that I show people when they ask, which shows the 120 Jubilees that lead from Adam and Eve right up to our current time. But in order for that to be the case, we have to correct the calendar by 27 years. And actually, there were a group of dendrochronologists who were tree ring scientists in the 1970s who put together a massive chronology of tree ring data going back from our time back to the time of Christ, or even before the time of Christ. And the lead dendrochronologist found a 27-year gap in where they could not find any tree ring samples in the year 300 or so, 310 to 338 AD. Our calendar, the Anno Domini calendar, wasn't created till 525 AD, so it's quite plausible that when the monk Dionysius, who put together the Anno Domini calendar, when he put it together, did not know about that 27-year gap. So our calendar's been perennially off by 27 years. Well, this affects the star programs that we have, like Stellarium and Starry Night, because when you look there at 24 AD, you're really looking at the year 3 BC. It's 27 years removed. And what I found in 24 AD, using Stellarium program, was a sign in the heaven where, in the sign of Virgo, she's clothed in the sun. The sun is right at her head. The new moon is at her feet. She has in her hand a branch, which is represented by the star Spica, which in Hebrew is Tessemic, which means the branch, and it's used in Isaiah referring to the Messiah, the branch of David, the righteous branch. And at that exact moment, Jupiter and Venus come into complete convergence with one another and create a bright star. And above her head is the constellation of Leo. And Leo has 11 prominent stars in it. What it says here in the prophecy that above her head are 12 stars. Well, it just so happens at that very moment that Jupiter and Venus are coming into conjunction at a time where she's clothed in the sun and the moon is at her feet, that Mercury was in the sign of Leo, so it meant that you now had 12 stars, so she had 12 stars above her head. I believe this is what the Magi saw in Babylon. And the Magi were Babylonians, but if you remember, because of the 70 years of ignoring the laws of Shemitah, many of the nobles in Israel were taken captive to Babylon, including Daniel, who became a great prophet and a precursor to many of the end-time prophecies. And he had read and he had studied what Jeremiah had wrote about the 70 years, and he repented for his nation. And it was after the time of Daniel that the children of Israel were released to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city under Ezra and Nehemiah. But anyways, I believe this great sign occurred in 24 AD, which is really 3 BC if we correct the calendar by 27 years. And it just so happens that the next time Jupiter and Venus, so you take the two brightest planets, the two brightest objects in the sky besides the sun and the moon, and you put them together, it creates a very bright star. I believe it's what the Bible calls it as his star. The next time Jupiter and Venus came into conjunction was 14 months later, which, being seen from Jerusalem looking out to the east, or in the rising, just before the sunrise rose in 24 AD, which I believe is really 2 BC, you have the convergence of these two stars coming together in the rising, and they move up in the sky, heading toward Bethlehem. And it's interesting because the Magi would have seen that. They said that they saw his star in the rising, and there was a prophetic significance to it, just as there was prophetic significance to Virgo, the virgin giving birth to the man-child. The significance of the second time these two stars came into convergence was the fact that his star came up in the rising right before the sun, the claws of Scorpio were right upon them. And this would have expressed danger to the Messiah, to the Magi. And that's exactly what they got in a dream from an angel, was that Herod was plotting to kill the Messiah. And he sent troops from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which was only 5 miles away, and had everyone under the age of 2 put to death. Well, Joseph and Mary were informed by another angel in a dream, and they escaped out of Bethlehem with Jesus. And we know the whole story and how they went to Egypt and the like. So we've got some really interesting signs going on. But going back to Daniel, let me find it here. Daniel chapter 12, Daniel talks about the end times. And he says, at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will rise. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until now. It says, and at that time, everyone whose name is found written in the book will be delivered. Multiples who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. There will be a great resurrection of the saints